Second adjective, strident, isolationist, or just plain unrealistic. Those are just some of the words being applied to the rhetoric and policies coming from the leading Republican candidates for U.S. president. The move to the far right has left the party fractured, with establishment Republicans battling for pragmatism and the soul of their party, leaving some wondering about its impact on international relations. Later, we'll talk with several political analysts, but we begin in our newsroom with CCTV's Jessica Stone. And Jessica, how did we get here?
Well, as you know, Anand, the Republican Party is one of two political parties in the United States. Congress is currently dominated by the Republican Party. Barack Obama, the president, is a Democrat. And by his own admission, American politics have gotten much more polarized during his presidency. Political experience here has become a liability, not an asset. And we've now got voters who want to elect someone they believe is an outsider. Outsiders, of course, don't know how to get things done in government, and that's led to further government dysfunction. The other driver here is that the U.S. economic recovery, it's really been very uneven. There are still around 10 million Americans who are unemployed or not able to get a full-time job that want one. They're angry, and that is also part of the reason we're seeing this anti-immigrant rhetoric, that it's really resonating. And it's a far cry from just 35 years ago when presidential candidates Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush debated how to reform U.S. immigration policy with compassion.
I don't want to see a whole thing of 6- and 8-year-old kids being made, one totally uneducated and made to feel that they're living with outside the law. And then while they're working and earning here, they pay taxes here.
Now, what's interesting here is, according to a Reuters poll that was taken last fall, about 40% of Americans surveyed by Reuters agreed with Trump on immigration. He's getting a lot more support even now on. And to remember, he is someone who said that some Mexican immigrants are rapists. He wants to build a wall to, quote, keep the illegals out. He's proposed a pause on Muslim refugees coming to the United States. And he and many other Republican presidential candidates also say the Iran nuclear deal is a bad one.
Jessica, if Donald Trump or the other leading candidate, Ted Cruz, are elected, what's the likely impact on U.S. foreign policy?
I think absolutely we would see a lot more isolationism. There's this race in the Republican Party to be the toughest, most nativist, most isolationist right now. Diplomatic engagement, coalition building of the sort we saw in and around World War II, those are really dirty words right now in the Republican Party. And we've heard candidate Ted Cruz promise to carpet bomb Daesh or ISIL in Syria, despite inevitable civilian casualties. You've also got businessman Donald Trump leading the polls with pledges to take away the terror group's oil. Former U.S. Defense Chief Bob Gates recently said on American television that both of those approaches are really unrealistic.
And furthermore, wouldn't accomplish the job. And I can't figure out whether those who are arguing that really believe they can do that, or whether they're just being cynical or opportunistic.
Well, I think what would really be very difficult for the U.S.'s international partners and beyond is that this move towards isolationism, after 8 years of a focus on diplomatic engagement in places like Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and even the Iran nuclear deal, this could really have real consequences for American allies and trading partners around the world. It certainly has the potential to be a sort of diplomatic whiplash. Anand.
Thanks, Jessica. That's CCTV's Jessica Stone reporting. Joining us from New York is Julio Ricardo Varela. He's the founder of LatinoRebels.com and the digital media editor for National Public Radio's Latino USA. With us here in Washington is American University Professor of Public Communication, Leonard Steinhorn. Historian Heather Cox Richardson joins us from Boston. Her book, To Make Men Free, covers the history of the Republican Party. And with us from Pittsburgh is Republican commentator Lenny McAllister. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Let's start with Lenny McAllister in Pittsburgh. Lenny, we just heard the former Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, say that the policies of these Republican candidates, the leading ones, Donald Trump, Ted Cruz, are unrealistic. Talk about building walls, banning Muslims, carpet bombing parts of the Middle East. If that is the case, what's the attraction then?
The attraction is going after the anger that the conservative base, which is not necessarily the Republican establishment, the conservative base has right now, that they've been frustrated since the Tea Party days of 2009 with both the Democrats and the Republicans. So that's why you have this outsider emphasis right now going on in the 2016 election. It's much like what you saw in 2012, where, if you remember, Michelle Bachmann had a chance at a bite at the apple. You had Herman Cain, who was at the top of the polls in 2011. You had Newt Gingrich, who came out of no place to be ahead at this point in time before we actually had the Iowa caucuses. And then a guy that was polling at 1 to 4%, Rick Santorum, ended up being in second place overall when you started counting the delegates at the end of the 2012 process. People want somebody that feels their frustration, their anger, and their anxiety about where the world is going and where the United States is going. Unfortunately, when you start talking about what looks presidential versus what looks winnable in Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, they're not exactly congruent strategies.
Heather, we just heard that little exchange there between candidate H.W. Bush and Ronald Reagan. They sounded a lot more reasonable. They sounded conciliatory when it came to the question of immigration. Now, you have said that American politics has descended from principle into tribalism. How did we get there? I mean, explain that in the first place.
Well, it's interesting to think of the idea that the problems with the Republican Party began in 2012 or 2010 with the formation of the Tea Party, because in fact the real problem came out of the New Deal way back in the 1930s. And what we have at heart now within the Republican Party, but also in America at large, is a contest between whether or not we will have an America that responds to the needs of all of its people to have equality of opportunity, or whether we will have a government that responds to the needs of the very wealthy to protect their property. And the problem for the Republican Party is that beginning in the wake of the New Deal and then really taking off in the 1950s after Brown v. Board of Education, then being cemented by Nixon and then finally by Ronald Reagan with his image, say, of the welfare queen, what we have is this idea that on the one hand you have freedom, individualism, the ability of everybody to create his own fiefdom, if you will, within society, because government will not raise taxes, government will not fund anything, versus the idea that, in fact, we need a government that responds to the needs of the entire society, and that's going to cost tax dollars. The problem is the Republicans have promised the one, but they simply can't cut everything that everybody likes, which costs tax dollars. And what we have right now is that moment where so many people have bought into the story that they can have a government that has no taxes and they can have these great prosperous lives, at the same time that they actually can't have that and still have Social Security and Medicare and roads and clean water. And right now they realize they've kind of been sold a bill of goods, and it's not playing very well on the ground.
Leonard, if we look at what is happening in the country right now, I mean, there's a lot of things that are happening. We look at changing demographics, a widening income inequality, terrorism, domestic gun violence. What do you make of this country's shift to the right?
Well, I don't think the country itself has shifted to the right.
Part of the country.
I think what's happening in the Republican Party is sort of, I use this expression, be careful what you wish for, you may get it. You know, the way I see the Republican Party, there are two strains. There's sort of the Chamber of Commerce establishment strain right now. There are people who see government as a burden. Government is a burden on freedom, on individual initiative, and they want to see lesser government, but they also accept change, but you have to manage change, go slowly. But there's that other strain that Richard Nixon first gave voice to when he talked about the silent majority, which Donald Trump is using, and the Southern strategy. And that's a strain that basically says that America has veered from the sort of traditional culture of the 1950s, the social order of the 1950s, and the people who are most angry about that shift are the people who felt most rooted in that social order and in those values. And you're seeing them gravitate to candidates like Ted Cruz and Donald Trump. This is the white working class that was predominant in the 1950s, and they have since lost power. So how does their resentment get manifested? It gets manifested in sort of anger at the other, anger at minorities, anger at anyone who seems to be threatening that Norman Rockwell view of America that they've mythologized over the years. So what they do to restore power, they go out and buy guns. They have very loud voices in the political environment. They gravitate to somebody like Donald Trump who says, let's make America great again, meaning like the America they had in the 1950s.
But is this new?
It's not new. No, I mean, we've seen this from time to time, but it began to sort of get magnified as the social liberalism of the 1960s began to dominate American culture and was symbolized by the election of Barack Obama, which may be one of the reasons why there's so much anger at a moderately liberal president because of what he represents.
If I can,
One moment, I'm going to come to you in a moment, Lenny. I just want to go to Julio. Julio, we've seen a very fierce and emotional debate about immigration right now. Donald Trump, for one, has been especially contemptuous of Mexican immigrants, as our reporter mentioned, calling them rapists, calling them thieves. Does it surprise you that despite these insults, he still enjoys the kind of popularity that he does, even if it's a small part of the Republican Party?
Well, actually, it doesn't surprise me, because I do agree with the panelists that this has sort of been brewing for a while. The irony of all this is, if you really want to start talking about Nixon and Reagan, actually, when you talk about Latinos in this country, the actual first candidate who turned the Latino outreach into a strategy was Richard Nixon. So when you look at the rise of the Amigo buses, where there were actually buses that went around in California and New York, that, you know, the Republican Party actually was going after the Latino vote, whatever it was in the 70s, and then with Reagan as well in the 80s. And this is a lot of what we do on the show at NPR's Latino USA. We start looking at what were the reasons, like where is the change? Now, when you look at that debate clip, which has become internet legend online in a lot of ways, when you see Ronald Reagan and George Bush talking about sort of this compassionate immigration policy, it was at a time when the United States was actually looking at cheap labor, was actually looking into free trade. There were a lot of conservative principles. You know, the last time when Reagan went through the first 1986 amnesty program, where he basically gave, you know, millions of mostly Central Americans and Latin American citizenship, like that all is connected to, you know, parts of Latin America that sort of felt into this sort of ideals of individualism and conservatism. And, you know, it's not ironic when you see that Reagan was beloved by a lot of Latinos in the 80s. And it's because if you look at, you know, the Central American wars and who left Central America, it was mostly like the white, elite, rich person. So, you know, you go to Reagan in the 80s, and then you fast forward to Bush, and then you come to Trump. You know, it's really sort of metastasized itself in a lot of ways, because what it's become is that you have to blame somebody. You have to blame the person that takes your job. And what better way to blame someone, what better image of the fleeing, you know, Central American, Latin American, Mexican immigrant that's going through this chaotic border, which is not true, it's factually incorrect. But that has been feeding into sort of the narrative for years, mostly under the surface. And Donald Trump has been able to capitalize on that. And I will say, when these original comments came out from Trump in the summer of last year, a lot of the Latino media was actually calling this out, and no one else was paying attention to this. Now, you know, so we kind of saw the writing on the wall, and we kind of saw the sense that Trump was going to hit a stride. And I've always taken his candidate very seriously, his candidacy very seriously, and I'm not surprised one bit that we are talking about him as the front runner right now. But in fact, like we say, and I think someone has alluded to this as sort of like the monster that you've created, this type of thinking of Mexicans are taking our jobs, Central Americans are taking over this country, that has been so, that has just been part of the narrative in the last 10 years.
Okay.
That Trump, you know, the only reason why Trump is popular is because people believe it, and that's why he's leading the polls.
Okay, Lenny, go ahead.
Well, number one, it's ironic that everybody keeps talking about Nixon and Reagan. If you go look at how the votes were for their elections, particularly Nixon, I believe, in 72, and Reagan in both 80 and particularly 84, they won 49 out of 50 states. And if you look at how they were as presidents, these were people that were seen as moderate Republicans. These weren't people that were campaigning on hatred, and they sure as heck didn't legislate as people that hated Latinos or hated African Americans or hated, you know, other type of minorities. If you look at Ronald Reagan's record, for example, he was the one that brought in Sandra Day O'Connor. If you look at African Americans in the 1980s, a black middle class thrived under Ronald Reagan. If you look at Nixon's records, you see the creation of the EPA, and you see all this civil rights legislation, including affirmative action, coming from Nixon. So to sit there and say that this has been brewing all the way back to Nixon and Reagan isn't quite as clear as it may seem to be. Now, with that said, if you go over the last 10 years, even past Bush, a president that recruited and really went after the Latino vote as a former Texas governor who had Latinos as members of his close family. Once you move past that and you get into the Tea Party era, where we were bleeding hundreds of thousands of jobs per month, where people were starting to see blue-collar jobs bleed, that's when people started looking around and saying, who should we blame? We blame Wall Street, we blame Wall Street Republicans, we blame Democrats, and we blame people that are taking cheap labor. This really solidified over the last 10 years, not necessarily during Reagan or through Nixon.